What's up, Glam Squad? It's Johanna with God is Glamorous, where we learn how to live our best lives through Jesus Christ. And today we're going to be talking all about gratitude and how to have more of a grateful heart. There is no question that when we are thankful for the things that God has given us, we end up having more. And this reminds me of a story the other day when I decided to grow my own wheatgrass. Yes, I grew my own wheatgrass. And I decided to do this because I'm actually anemic, and what this means is my body has a much harder time retaining oxygen and retaining iron within my bloodstream. So I decided to do my research, and instead of going to vitamins, I wanted to take a more natural approach. And I found that wheatgrass is the best way to build up your bloodstream in your system when it comes to overcoming anemia and things of that nature. So tip for all you anemics out there, definitely check out wheatgrass. But anyway, I got this wheatgrass kit that I found online, and I decided to grow my own wheatgrass. And it came with seeds, and it came with soil. So I laid the soil out, I put the seeds in it, and I watered it and took care of it for after a few days. And then about 4 to 5 days, it was ready to juice because I had inches of wheatgrass available. So as I'm juicing my wheatgrass, I'm cutting the wheatgrass and I'm juicing it, and then I realized the smell was not that great. Like it was not a good smell, and while juicing it, it just tasted bad. It wasn't that good. But as I was complaining about how bad the wheatgrass tasted, I decided to have an attitude of gratitude. I decided to become thankful because, number one, I didn't grow that wheatgrass on my own. Like, I may have watered the wheatgrass and I may have taken care of it and put it in soil, but it was God that essentially allowed that wheatgrass to grow. All I had to do was water it, but God worked behind the scenes to make that wheatgrass become a reality for me. And also I began to become more thankful because I realized that this wheatgrass is helping me to become healthier. This wheatgrass is giving me the minerals and the vitamins that my body needs to thrive. So instead of becoming ungrateful and complaining about how bad it tasted, I began to become thankful for the fact that God allowed me to grow that wheatgrass. God gave me the resources that I needed to purchase the wheatgrass kit. And more importantly, when God was creating wheatgrass, He had me in mind because He knew that my body was going to need it. So I just began to become grateful. And every time that I began to juice my wheatgrass, although it's not the best tasting, I just still practice gratitude because I know that this is something that God has given me and given us, and it's going to be beneficial for me. So instead of grumbling and complaining, I began to become thankful. And speaking of becoming thankful, this reminds me of a story with Jesus and the 10 lepers and how He healed these 10 lepers. So there is a story where these 10 men, they all had leprosy. And leprosy was a really, really terrible skin disease that was also contagious. So if anyone had leprosy, they were shunned away from the community and they were considered unclean. So they could not be around any people. But they actually saw Jesus and they came to Jesus and they asked Jesus to heal them. And Jesus said, "Go show yourself to the priest." So as they were walking, they were being healed because the priests were considered holy, and of course there could be no unclean men in front of the priest in that time. But as they were going to the priest, their skin became healed, and they were healed of that leprosy. So there were 10 men that went towards the priest, but as one person saw that they were being healed, they stopped, they turned around, and they came back to Jesus, and they said, "Thank you." So in Luke chapter 17, verses 17 through 18, Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?" So as you can see, this foreigner comes to Jesus and he gives praise, and he says thank you to Jesus. And Jesus is essentially like, where is the other 9? Where are the other 9? And this is exactly how we are today. We are sometimes the other 9. When God gives us all these kind of blessings, we rarely stop and we rarely say thank you. When's the last time that you said thank you when God blessed you with an opportunity that you may be taking for granted right now? Or we are like the other 9 when we dive into our amazing meal that we're about to eat and we don't say grace. We are like the other 9 when God gives us all these blessings and we rarely stop and say thank you. And when we practice gratitude and when we always pause and say thank you for the amazing things that God has blessed us with, we end up having more. So for those of you who don't know the story of Jesus and the 5,000, definitely check it out. But this is a story where Jesus miraculously feeds 5,000 people with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And this was so significant because they didn't have any food. And there was just one person that offered their 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And instead of Jesus saying, what can we do with this? Do you not see 5,000 people? Jesus took that 5 loaves of bread, took that 2 fish, those 2 fish, and he took it to God and he thanked God for it. And after he thanked God for just the little bit that he had, those 5 loaves of fish, those 5 loaves of bread, and those 2 fish began to multiply, and they actually fed the entire crowd of 5,000. So it says in Matthew chapter 14, verses 19 through 21, and he directed the people to sit down on the grass, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to the heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So, really profound stuff here. So it says they all ate, they were all satisfied, and they had 12 baskets that were left over. And not only were there 5,000, there were 5,000 men alone. And there were also women and children that were not even counted for. So this is well over 5,000 people that Jesus was able to feed with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And this is a really interesting lesson for us because we have to ask ourselves, have we been thanking God for the 5 pieces of bread and the 2 fish that he's given us? Are we thanking God with the small things? Because how do we expect to have more if we just can't thank God for the little things that God has blessed us with? If we are stuck in a job that we hate and we want to go to a new job, or if we want to pursue entrepreneurship, how do you expect God to promote you to CEO of your own company if you can't thank God for the 9 to 5 that God has already given you? How do you expect God to give you a promotion if you can't even thank God for the little things that you already have? So we have to learn how to thank God for our 5 loaves and our 2 fish, because before we can even expect something greater, we have to be able to thank God in the little things. And speaking of thanking God for the little things, why don't we learn to stop complaining and finding the beauty in every situation? So my favorite story in the Bible is the children of Israel, when God frees them from slavery in Egypt and he takes them to the new land, the land flowing with milk and honey, the land of Israel. And during this time, they are wandering from Egypt to the promised land. And essentially, this journey was supposed to take only 11 days. But because of their ungratefulness and their constant complaining, that journey of 11 days turned into wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, just because of their constant complaining. So throughout this time, you have to read it if you haven't checked it out, but they are constantly complaining about everything. So they're complaining about their hunger, they're complaining about what they want to eat. So this is the time where the Israelites needed to be extremely grateful, because God had done so much for them during that time. Number one, he freed them from slavery after 400 years. He parted the Red Sea and allowed them to enter the Red Sea so they wouldn't get captured by the Egyptians again, to bring them back to slavery. And there were just so many miracles that he did. But during this time, they got really hungry. And God allowed bread to fall from the sky. It was called manna. It was like this waferly, flaky, pastry-like bread. And every single day, they did not have to work for their food. They didn't have to hunt. God literally supplied food for them. And instead of being grateful for the bread that they had, they started to complain, and then they wanted meat, they wanted quail. And they were so hungry and so full of complaining that they actually wished that instead of God saving them from the Egyptians, they actually wished that God actually would have killed them in Egypt. It says in Exodus chapter 16, verse 3, "And the children of Israel said to them, 'Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, and we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger.'" So here they are complaining that they don't have enough to eat, so God comes through and he gives them bread to eat. So in verse 4 it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather certain quota every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not.'" So God is faithful, and instead of getting upset that they're complaining, God grants their requests and gives them bread to eat. So eventually they get tired of the bread and they start complaining that they want meat. So in Numbers chapter 11, verses 4 through 6, it says, "Now the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, 'Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our whole being is dried up. There is nothing at all except this manna before our eyes.'" How many of us are like the children of Israel? When we ask God for the things that we want, and then God gives us what we want, and then we're just tired of it, and we want something better. This is exactly what the children of Israel did. They were complaining that they were hungry. God sends them bread or manna to fall from the sky, and then they become ungrateful of what God has given them. They become ungrateful of the very thing that they asked for. And this is exactly like us. We pray and ask God to give us this job. We pray and ask God to give us this house. We pray and ask God to give us kids. And then we end up complaining about the very things that we ask God to do. So we have to remember that the things that we are complaining about may have once been the things that we have prayed and asked God for. So always remember to have that grateful heart and to constantly give God thanks in every situation. So God was patient again, and instead of giving them bread, then God also sent quail for them to eat. So it says in Numbers chapter 11, verses 31 through 33, "Now a wind went out from the Lord, and it brought quail from the sea and left them fluttering near the camp, about a day's journey on this side and about a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, and about 2 cubits above the surface of the ground." It also says, "But while the meat was still between their teeth, before it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was aroused against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very great plague." So God was faithful, and he gave them all the meat to eat. And he gave them so much. It was about a day's distance from one side of the land to the other. So it was just so much. But also while they were eating, God was upset, and he also sent a plague on the people because they were just so ungrateful. And during the time when God sent bread and when he sent quail, they did not say thank you one time. Instead, they were just constantly complaining. So in Exodus chapter 16, verse 8, it says, "Moses also said, 'You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but the Lord.'" So it's really important for you to remember that when you are complaining, you're not complaining against that specific thing. You're complaining to God about it, because it's God that gives you everything. Everything that you're complaining about, it's God that gives it to you. And just like the children of Israel, Moses reminded them that, hey, you're not complaining to us. You're complaining to God, so you have to remember that. So it's just always in your best interest to practice an attitude of gratitude, because there is so much to be grateful for. And more importantly, is especially to be grateful when things are not always going your way. So if you haven't read the story of Job, it is one of the most incredible stories in the whole Bible. And Job was a very, very, very wealthy man who had everything. He was extremely wealthy. He had it all. So it says that his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. So as you can see, Job was very, very, very wealthy. But he actually went through a time where he lost everything, and he lost everything in just one split second. So it says, one day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, the fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground and worshipped, and said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Wow, that is incredible. So as you can see, within 1 minute, he hears news that everything that he has is lost. He loses all his animals. He loses all his employees. He loses all his sons and daughters and a collapsing of a roof. He loses everything. And what he does is he gets down on his knees and he begins to worship and he begins to praise. That is incredible. So during this time when Job loses everything, his wife encourages him to get upset with God. And this is what she says. So in verse 9 it says, then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. And in verse 10, Job says, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So his wife comes to him and she's like, bruh, you're like messed up right now. Why don't you just die? Why don't you just curse God? And why don't you just call it quits? And Job says, no. Are we going to accept the great things God has for us, but we're not going to accept the bad that comes with it? So instead of grumbling and complaining, just like the children of Israel did, Job instead thanked God even in the midst of his storm. So even though we don't necessarily need to be thankful for the bad things that happens in our lives, it's important to be thankful in those bad times. So there's a difference. So in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, starting at verse 16, it says, rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Jesus Christ. So during this time when Job lost everything, he literally not only lost everything, but he began to have boils all over his skin. He got really, really sick. And still during that time, he was worshiping and praising God and through it all. And at the end of the story, God doubled everything that he had. So in Job chapter 42, starting at verse 12, it says, now the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, for he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. So as you can see, God blessed Job with a double portion of what he had. And he also gave Job back his 3 daughters and his 7 sons. So it's important to remember that even though we are going through bad times, there's still something to be grateful for. Or even if you aren't grateful in that moment, still say thank you and know that whatever you're going through, God always works it out for your good. So it's important to understand to always practice gratitude, because when you do, you're always going to end up having more. And more importantly, thank God even in the midst of your storm. Don't complain. Constantly thank God, because in the end, God is going to work that thing out for your good. All right, so I hope this helped. Happy Thanksgiving. And just remember to always see the silver lining in everything, because when you look around you, there's so much to be grateful for. All right, love you guys, and I'll talk to you later. Stay glamorous.